On a winter night in 1534, behind the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, a single act of defiance shattered 300 years of sacred law and set in motion a transformation that would reshape 3 continents. What transpired in those hidden chambers was not simply a wedding ceremony. It was a carefully orchestrated revolution disguised as romance, and the woman at its center had been planning this moment for 13 years. Her name was Hurrem Sultan, known to the West as Roxolana, and before that night ended she would break 5 untouchable imperial codes that no ruler had dared violate since Osman himself founded the dynasty in 1299. But the true horror of this story is not what she did on her wedding night. It is what came after, when the blood of princes stained the silk carpets and an empire built on military conquest found itself ruled from behind a veil by a woman no man was permitted to name aloud. The year was 1521 when a 15-year-old Ukrainian girl named Alexandra Anastasia Lisovska arrived in chains at the slave markets of Kaffa, torn from her father's modest Orthodox parish in Rohatyn during brutal Tatar raids that left her village in ashes. The traders who inspected her saw something rare in those green eyes, and that cascade of red hair, a color so unusual in the Ottoman world that it raised her price to extraordinary levels. Within months she had been purchased for the imperial harem delivered to Hafsa Sultan, the mother of the young Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who recognized in this terrified girl not just beauty but something far more dangerous. Intelligence sharp enough to cut through the palace's ancient hierarchies like a blade through silk. They renamed her Harem, meaning the joyful one, but there was nothing joyful in the education that followed. For months she was trained in the arts that transformed concubines into instruments of power learning: Ottoman, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, mastering court etiquette and the refined techniques of seduction that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the mind. When Suleiman first summoned her in 1521, he was 26 years old, a warrior pot who had inherited an empire stretching from the gates of Vienna to the coasts of Yemen, and he expected nothing more than a single night's pleasure from this red-haired slave girl. But Hurrem understood something the Sultan did not yet realize about himself. Beneath his absolute power lay a loneliness so profound that it made him vulnerable in ways no army could exploit. She gave him not just passion but intellectual companionship, political insight wrapped in intimate whispers, and, most dangerous of all, the illusion that she alone in all his vast empire truly understood the burden of his crown. By 1522, she had borne him a son named Mehmed, and according to every law written since the 14th century, that should have been the end of her story. Ottoman tradition was brutally clear: 1 concubine, 1 son, then permanent exile from the Sultan's bed to prevent any single woman from accumulating dynastic power. But Hurrem had no intention of following tradition. Over the next 4 years, she shattered that sacred law again and again, bearing Mirama in 1522, Selim in 1524, Bazid in 1525, and later Abdullah and Sahanjur, each child a calculated violation that concentrated unprecedented power in her hands. Palace whispers turned to outrage, and Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's closest friend since childhood, watched with growing alarm as this Slavic slave accumulated influence that threatened the empire's stability. In secret correspondence preserved in Venetian archives, Ibrahim warned that Hurrem was building something unprecedented. A shadow government operating from the forbidden quarters of the harem where no woman had ever been permitted to touch the machinery of state. But Hurrem was always 3 moves ahead, and she knew that Ibrahim Pasha himself would have to be removed before she could claim what she truly wanted. Not just influence but legitimacy itself, sealed in a marriage that would force the entire empire to acknowledge her as empress. The first obstacle fell in March 1534 when Hafsa Sultan, the only woman powerful enough to oppose Hurrem's ambitions, died suddenly in her chambers after months of declining health that palace physicians would later quietly suggest bore all the hallmarks of slow arsenic poisoning, though no investigation was ever permitted. With Suleiman's mother gone, Hurrem moved against Ibrahim Pasha himself, launching a whisper campaign so subtle and so devastating that within 2 years, the Grand Vizier, who had stood at the Sultan's side through a dozen military campaigns, would be strangled with a bowstring in his sleep, executed on Suleiman's orders for treason that existed only in rumors Hurrem had carefully planted like seeds in poisoned soil. And then, with both obstacles removed, she made a demand: marriage, an act so forbidden that it required rewriting the very laws of succession themselves. If you're drawn to these dark corners of history where power and seduction blur into something almost supernatural, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to reveal about Hurrem's wedding night and the empire-shattering consequences that followed will change everything. You thought you knew about the Ottoman world. The story you're hearing is based on diplomatic letters, Vatican archives, and palace records that historians have spent centuries piecing together from fragments, and what they reveal is more chilling than any legend. The wedding preparations began in absolute secrecy throughout late 1534, erased from official chronicles by court historians who understood that recording such an event would be admitting that the impossible had occurred. No Ottoman Sultan had married a concubine since the reign of Orhan in 1326, and the law was carved in stone for a reason. Royal marriages were reserved for foreign princesses, diplomatic tools that bound empires together through bloodlines and prevented any single slave woman from claiming the legitimacy of an empress. But Hurrem had spent 13 years mastering the art of making the impossible seem inevitable, and she had discovered a loophole so elegant that even the conservative ulama could not quite argue against it. She would be formally freed by imperial decree on the morning of her wedding day, transforming her from slave to free woman in the hours before the ceremony, technically satisfying the letter of the law while violating its spirit so profoundly that the entire foundation of Ottoman succession trembled. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the empire had ever witnessed, fusing Islamic ritual with Byzantine imperial pomp in a spectacle that announced to every ambassador, every vizier, and every rival that the old world had died and something new and terrifying had taken its place. Byzantine jewelers adorned her in treasures once reserved for dynastic princesses, while Arab perfumers prepared oils that cost more than provincial tax revenues, and when she finally entered those bridal chambers decorated with opulence surpassing even coronations, every person present understood they were witnessing not romance but constitutional upheaval dressed in silk and gold. What transpired behind those closed doors went far beyond the intimacy expected of a wedding night. Suleiman and Hurrem spent those hours planning reforms, discussing succession policies, and mapping out how to silence the backlash that would soon erupt across 3 continents. Venetian spies who managed to bribe palace servants for fragments of information reported back to their masters with confusion at first, calling it an eccentricity of a sultan drunk on passion. But within months, as Hurrem's influence became undeniable, those same ambassadors realized they had witnessed revolution disguised as matrimony. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Hurrem became Huseki Sultan, a title invented specifically for her that had never existed in Ottoman history, combining the Persian word for sole favorite with the Arabic word for sovereign ruler, placing her on equal footing with European empresses and higher than any woman in the empire's 300-year history. She moved permanently into Topkapi Palace, itself shattering the ancient law that forbade women of the harem from residing in the seat of government, and architects constructed secret passages and hidden chambers that allowed her to observe imperial council meetings through specially designed barred windows, turning the palace itself into an instrument of surveillance. Ministers conducting state business never knew if their words were being overheard by the sultana or carried through primitive listening devices that whispered through the walls, creating a paranoia that twisted court culture into something resembling a proto-police state. But Hurrem's most devastating move was still to come, and it would be written in the blood of the one person who stood between her sons and absolute power. Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by his former favorite Mahidevran, was beloved by the Janissaries, brilliant in military command, and by every law of succession, the rightful heir to the throne. For nearly 2 decades, Hurrem waged a psychological war against him, using her network of spies, bribed secretaries, and forged documents to slowly poison Suleiman's trust in his own firstborn. The deception reached its terrible climax in 1553 during Suleiman's Persian campaign, when Hurrem and her son-in-law Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha produced evidence so flawlessly constructed that it appeared to prove Mustafa was conspiring with the Safavid enemy. When Mustafa was summoned to his father's tent on the plains of Konya, he walked in, trusting the ancient guarantee of safety that princes were granted during family audiences. Behind the silk curtains, mute executioners waited with bowstrings, and as Suleiman watched unmoved, they strangled the life from his eldest son, while Mustafa's final gasps echoed through the tent like a curse that would haunt the dynasty for generations. The empire convulsed with horror. Janissaries revolted in rage over their murdered commander. Riots had to be crushed with brutal force, temporarily crippling Ottoman military strength and giving European powers breathing room they had not expected. But Mustafa's death secured what Hurrem had fought for since that first night in 1521. Her sons, particularly Selim, now stood as the only viable heirs, and the path to the throne ran through her bloodline alone. What had begun as a forbidden wedding night had metastasized into something historians would call the Sultanate of Women. A century and a half, when mothers, wives, and sisters of sultans wielded power that rivaled or exceeded the rulers, themselves conducting diplomacy, appointing grand viziers, and in some cases ordering the execution of sultans who threatened their control. Hurrem herself died in 1558. But her shadow stretched across generations. Her immediate successors, Hurrem Sultan and Savia Sultan, expanded the precedents she had established, while later figures like Hurrem Sultan would wield such authority that she commanded military campaigns and deposed emperors who defied her will. What had seemed like scandal in 1534 had hardened into accepted reality, and foreign courts that initially recoiled in horror learned to adapt, sending gifts specifically crafted for the sultanas, and acknowledging them as legitimate powers in their diplomatic calculations. The woman who entered the palace in chains in 1521 had rewritten the rules of an empire, and the cost of that revolution was measured not just in broken traditions but in the blood of princes strangled in their father's presence and the ghosts of 1,000 what-ifs that haunt Ottoman history like whispers through secret passages. What do you think? Was Hurrem Sultan a brilliant revolutionary who shattered unjust restrictions on women's power? Or was she a ruthless manipulator whose ambition destabilized an empire and cost innocent lives? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. because this story raises questions about power, gender, and the price of breaking sacred laws that feel as relevant today as they did nearly 5 centuries ago.